Hello, everyone. I hope you're all well and safe. Today we will be doing the reading of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory by Roald Dahl. And during our reading, we will also have a small poll with you where you will have questions flashing on your screen and you have 60 seconds to answer them. Let's begin. Chapter 1. These two very old people are the father and mother of Mr. Bucket. Their names are Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine. And these two very old people are the father and mother of Mrs. Bucket. Their names are Grandpa George and Grandpa Georgina. There is Mr. Bucket and Mrs. Bucket. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket have a small boy whose name is Charlie. This is Charlie. How do you do? And how do you do? And how do you do again? He is pleased to meet you. The whole of this family, the 6 grown-ups, and the little Charlie Bucket live together in a small wooden house on the edge of the great town. The house wasn't nearly large enough for so many people, and life was extremely uncomfortable for them all. There were only 2 rooms in the place altogether, and there was only 1 bed. The bed was given to the 4 old grandparents because they were so old and tired. They were so tired, they were never getting out of it. Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine on one side, Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina on the other side. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket and the little Charlie Bucket slept in the other room upon the mattresses on the floor. In the summertime, this wasn't too bad, but in the winter, freezing cold drafts blew across the floor all night long, and it was awful. There wasn't any questions of them being able to buy a better house or even 1 more bed to sleep in. They were too poor for that. Mr. Bucket was the only person in the family with a job. He worked in a toothpaste factory where he sat all day long at the bench and screwed the little cap screwers excuse me, onto the tops of the tubes of the toothpaste after the tubes have been filled. But a toothpaste cap screwer can never be paid very much money, and poor Mr. Bucket, however hard he worked and however fast he screwed on the caps, was never able to make enough to buy 1/2 of the things that such a large family needed. There was even enough money to buy proper food for them all. The only meals they could afford were bread and margarine for breakfast, boiled potatoes and cabbage for lunch, and a cabbage soup for supper. Sundays were a bit better. They looked forward to Sundays because then, although they had exactly the same, everyone was allowed a second helping. The Buckets, of course, didn't starve, but every one of them, the 2 old grandfathers, the 2 old grandmothers, Charlie's father, Charlie's mother, and especially little Charlie himself, went about from morning till night with a horrible feeling in their tummies. Charlie felt it the worst of all, and although his father and mother often went without their own share of lunch or supper so they could give it to him, it still wasn't nearly enough for a growing boy. He desperately wanted something more filling and satisfying than cabbage and cabbage soup. The one thing he longed for more than anything else was chocolate. Walking to school in the mornings, Charlie could see great slabs of chocolate piled up high in the shop windows, and he would stop and stare and press his little nose against the glass, his mouth watering like mad. Many times a day, he would see other children taking bars of creamy chocolate out of their pockets and munching them greedily. And that, of course, was a pure torture. Only once a year, on his birthday, did Charlie Bucket ever get to taste a bit of chocolate. The whole family saved up their money for that one special occasion. And when that great day arrived, Charlie was always presented with one small chocolate bar to eat all by himself. And each time he received it on those marvelous birthday mornings, he would place it carefully in a small wooden box that he owned and treasure it as though it was a bar of solid gold. And for the next few days, he would allow himself only to look at it, but never to touch it. Then, at last, when he couldn't stand it no longer, he would peel back a tiny bit of paper wrapping at one corner to expose a tiny bit of chocolate. And then he would take a tiny little nibble, just enough to allow the lovely, sweet taste to spread slowly out all over his tongue. The next day, he would take another tiny nibble, and so on and so on. And in this way, Charlie would make his six-penny bar of birthday chocolate last him for more than a month. But I haven't yet told you about the one awful thing that tortured little Charlie, the lover of chocolate, more than anything else. This thing, for him, was far, far worse than seeing slabs of chocolate in the shop windows or watching other children munching bars of creamy chocolate right in front of him. It was the most terrible, torturing thing you can imagine. And it was this. In the town itself, actually within the sight of the house in which Charlie lived, there was an enormous chocolate factory. Just imagine that. And it wasn't simply an ordinary, enormous chocolate factory either. It was the largest and the most famous in the whole world. It was Wonka's factory, owned by a man called Willy Wonka, the greatest inventor and maker of chocolates that has ever been. And what a tremendous, marvelous place it was. It had huge iron gates leading into it, and high walls around it, and the smoke belching from its chimneys, and strange whizzing sounds coming from deep inside it. And outside the walls, for half a mile around in every direction, the air was scented with a heavy, rich smell of melting chocolate. Twice a day, on his way to and from school, little Charlie Bucket had to walk right past the gates of the factory. And every time he went by, he would begin to walk very, very slowly. And he would hold his nose high in the air and take long, deep sniffs of the gorgeous chocolatey smell all around him. Oh, how he loved that smell. And oh, how he wished he could go inside the factory and see what it's like. End of chapter 1. Pay attention to your screens. The poll is starting. Don't forget, you have 60 seconds to answer it correctly. Everybody ready? Do we know answer to this question? Let's go to chapter 2. Mr. Willy Wonka's factory. In the evenings, after he had finished his supper of watery cabbage soup, Charlie always went into the room of his 4 grandparents to listen to their stories, and then afterwards to say goodnight. Every one of these old people was over 90. They were as shriveled as prunes and as bony as skeletons. And throughout the day, until Charlie made his appearance, they lay huddled in their one bed, 2 at either end with nightcaps on to keep their heads warm, dozing all the time away with nothing to do. But as soon as they heard the door opening and heard Charlie's voice saying, "Good evening, Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine and Grandpa George and Grandpa Georgina," then all 4 of them would suddenly sit up and their old wrinkled face would light up with smiles of pleasure, and the talking would begin, for they loved this little boy. He was the only bright thing in their lives, and his evening visits were something that they looked forward to all day long. Often, Charlie's mother and father would come in as well and stay by the door, listening to the stories that the old people told. And thus, for perhaps half an hour every night, this room would become a happy place, and the whole family would forget that it was hungry and poor. One evening, when Charlie went in to see his grandparents, he said to them, "Is it really true that Wonka's chocolate factory is the biggest one in the world?" "True," cried all 4 of them at once. "Of course it's true. Good heavens! Didn't you know that? It's about 50 times as big as any other. And Mr. Willy Wonka, really the cleverest chocolate maker in the world." "My dear boy," said Grandpa Joe, raising himself up a little higher on his pillow, "Mr. Willy Wonka is the most amazing, the most fantastic, the most extraordinary chocolate maker in the world that has ever been seen. I thought everybody knew that." "I knew he was famous, Grandpa Joe, and I knew he was very clever." "Clever?" cried the old man. "He's more than that. He's a magician with chocolate. He can make anything he wants. Isn't that a fact, my dears?" The other 3 old people nodded their heads slowly up and down and said, "Absolutely true, as true as it can be." And Grandpa Joe said, "You mean to say I've never told you about Mr. Willy Wonka and his factory?" "Never," answered little Charlie. "Good heavens above! I don't know what's the matter with me. Will you tell me now, Grandpa Joe, please?" "I certainly will. Sit down beside me on the bed, my dear. Listen carefully." Grandpa Joe was the oldest of the 4 grandparents. He was 96 and a half, and that is just about as old as anybody can be. Like all extremely old people, he was delicate and weak, and throughout the day, he spoke very little. But in the evenings, when Charlie, his beloved grandson, was in the room, he seemed in some kind of marvelous way to grow quite young again, and his tiredness fell away from him, and he became as eager, as excited as a young boy. "Oh, what a man he is, this Willy Wonka," cried Grandpa Joe. "Did you know, for example, that he has himself invented more than 200 new kinds of chocolate bars, each with a different center, each sweeter and creamier and more delicious than anything other chocolate factories can make?" "Perfectly true," cried Grandma Josephine. "And he sends them to all the 4 corners of the earth. Isn't that so, Grandpa Joe?" "It is, my dear, it is. And to all the kings and presidents of the world as well. But it isn't only chocolate bars that he makes. Oh, dear me, no. He has some really fantastic inventions up his sleeve. Mr. Willy Wonka has. Did you know that he has invented a way of making chocolate ice cream so that it stays cold for hours and hours without being in the refrigerator? You can even leave it lying in the sun all morning on a hot day and it won't go running." "But that's impossible," said little Charlie, staring at his grandfather. Of course it's impossible, cried Grandpa Joe. It's completely absurd. But Mr. Willy Wonka has done it. Quite right, the others agreed, nodding their heads. Mr. Wonka has done it. And then again, Grandpa Joe went on speaking very slowly now so that Charlie wouldn't miss a word. Mr. Willy Wonka can make marshmallows that taste of violets and rich caramels that change color every 10 seconds as you suck them, and the little feathery sweets that melt away deliciously the moment you put them between your lips. He can make a chewing gum that never loses its taste, and the sugar balloons that you can blow up to enormous sizes before you pop them with a pin and gobble them up. And by a most secret method, he can make lovely bluebird eggs with black spots on them. And when you put one of those in your mouth, it gradually gets smaller and smaller until suddenly there is nothing left except a tiny little pink sugary baby bird sitting on the tip of your tongue. Grandpa Joe paused and ran the point of his tongue slowly over his lips. It makes my mouth water just thinking about it, he said. Mine too, said little Charlie. But please go on. While they were talking, Mr. and Mrs. Bucket, Charlie's mother and father, had come quietly into the room, and now both were standing just inside the door listening. Tell Charlie about the crazy Indian prince, said Grandma Josephine. He'd like to hear that. You mean Prince Pondicherry, said Grandpa Joe, and he began chuckling with laughter. Completely dotty, said Grandpa George, but very rich, said Grandma Georgina. What did he do? Asked Charlie eagerly. Listen, said Grandpa Joe, and I will tell you. Time for our second poll question, boys and girls. Are you ready? Don't forget that you have only 60 seconds to answer it. And do we remember the first question we had? Do we remember the answer to it? It was chocolate. Think very carefully. How old was the grandpa? Are we ready? Did we answer? We have 20 seconds left. How old was Grandpa? He was 96 and a half years old. Let's go to the chapter 3. Mr. Wonka and the Indian Prince. Prince Pondicherry wrote a letter to Mr. Willy Wonka, said Grandpa Joe, and asked him to come all the way from India and build him a colossal palace entirely out of chocolate. Did Mr. Wonka do it, Grandpa? He did indeed, and what a palace it was. It had 100 rooms, and everything was made of either dark chocolate or light chocolate. The bricks were made of chocolate, and all the walls and ceilings were made of chocolate. So were the carpets and the pictures and the furniture and the beds. And when you turned on the taps in the bathroom, hot chocolate just came pouring out. When it was all finished, Mr. Wonka said to Prince Pondicherry, I warn you though, it won't last very long, so you'd better start eating it right away. Nonsense, shouted the prince. I'm not going to eat my palace. I'm not even going to nibble the staircase or lick the walls. I'm going to live in it. But Mr. Wonka was right, of course, because soon after this, there came a very, very hot day with the boiling sun. and the whole palace began to melt, and then it sank slowly, slowly to the ground. And the crazy prince, who was dozing in the living room at the time, woke up to find himself swimming around in the huge, brown, sticky lake of chocolate. Little Charlie sat very still on the edge of the bed, staring at his grandfather. Charlie's face was bright and his eyes were stretched so wide you could see the whites all around. And is this really true? He asked. Or are you just pulling my leg? It's true, cried all four of the old people at once. Of course it's true. Ask anyone you like. And I'll tell you something else that's true, said Grandpa Joe. And now he leaned closer to the Charlie and lowered his voice to a soft, secret whisper. Nobody ever comes out. Out of where? Asked Charlie. And nobody ever goes in. In where? Cried Charlie. Wonka's factory, of course. Grandpa, what do you mean? I mean workers, Charlie. Workers? All factories, said Grandpa Joe, have workers streaming in and out of the gates in the mornings and evenings, except Wonka's. Have you ever seen a single person going into that place or coming out? Little Charlie looked slowly around at each of the four old faces, one after the other, and they looked all back at him. They were friendly, smiling faces, but they were also quite serious. There was no sign of joking or leg pulling of any of them. Well, have you? Asked Grandpa Joe. I really don't know, Grandpa, Charlie stammered. Whenever I walk past the factory, the gates seem to be closed. Exactly, said Grandpa Joe. But there must be people working there. Not people, Charlie. Not ordinary people anyway. Then who? Cried Charlie. Aha! That's it, you see. That's another of Mr. Willy Wonka's clevernesses. Charlie, dear, Mrs. Beckett called out from where she was standing by the door. It's time for bed. That's enough for tonight. But Mother, I must hear. Tomorrow, my darling. That's right, said Grandpa Joe. I'll tell you the rest of it tomorrow evening. Okay, boys and girls, are you ready for the last question? Don't forget, you have only 60 seconds to answer it. For whom did Willy Wonka build the chocolate place? Palace. Does anybody know? Did we answer our question? It was the Prince Pondicherry. I hope everybody answered correctly. That's it for today, boys and girls. I hope you enjoyed our story. For the next readings of our online reading session, please follow us on Instagram and on Valedra_education sites. Looking forward to seeing you all again and have a great day.